The first sound was not the gavel. It was the crack of an open palm. The courtroom froze. Every whisper evaporated into the stale air. The bailiff's hand was still suspended mid-air, as if even he couldn't believe what he'd just done. On the receiving end sat Amara Lewis, 34 years old, a legal researcher, community advocate, and the kind of woman who carried herself like she knew the truth, weighed heavier than any badge in the room. Her cheek was red, her posture unchanged. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she simply locked eyes with the man in uniform, the same man sworn to uphold order, and for a split second, it looked like he stepped back, as though her gaze carried more authority than his badge. From the bench, the judge muttered something about maintaining decorum. But here's the thing, decorum had just been shattered. This was no outburst from a protester. This was inside the very machine that promised justice, the place where the law was supposed to speak louder than violence. The cameras in the back of the room caught it all. So did half the city, who would be watching it by nightfall. But no one in that moment could have guessed what would happen next. Because 37 seconds later, Amara Lewis, the woman slapped in open court, would be sitting in the judge's seat, looking down at the very man who struck her. And it wouldn't be a stunt. It wouldn't be a protest. It would be the beginning of a legal earthquake that would rattle every courtroom in the state. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes power doesn't change hands with noise. Sometimes it changes in silence, in the gap between humiliation and the choice to stand. She didn't know it yet, but the events that led her here had been set in motion years before, by the same system she was about to outmaneuver. Long before the slap, Amara Lewis understood the rules of power, and how those rules shifted when you were black, a woman, and unafraid to speak. She grew up in the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where courtrooms weren't places of justice, they were revolving doors. Her father, a postal worker, taught her discipline. Her mother, a librarian, taught her that books held the blueprints for every fight she'd ever face. Amara's earliest memories of the law weren't of lawyers winning cases. They were of neighbors losing their homes over paperwork they didn't understand. Of brothers and sisters taken away in squad cars, while judges read from scripts, barely looking up. At 17, she watched her cousin, a quiet kid who loved fixing cars, be sentenced for a crime he didn't commit. The defense attorney, court-appointed and overworked, never called a single witness. The prosecutor smirked when the verdict came in. The judge was already looking at his next case file. That day, Amara made a promise. If she couldn't stop the machine, she would learn how it worked, every lever, every hidden gear. She earned a law degree, but instead of joining a big firm, she became a legal researcher and community advocate, specializing in cases where the system was stacked against ordinary people. She learned to read body language in court, to spot procedural errors that most lawyers missed, to ask questions in depositions that unraveled lies thread by thread. But the reason she was in this courtroom today went beyond one case. It started with a corruption network, judges, clerks and police, running what the locals called a justice tax. Defendants who couldn't pay, they got harsher sentences. Those who could, charges disappeared like smoke. Amara had been investigating this for months, quietly collecting evidence. The slap wasn't set random, it was a warning. They wanted her rattled, humiliated. They wanted the public to see her as another disruptive black woman who didn't respect the court. Here sits the problem with trying to break someone like Amara. She didn't play for the crowd, she played for the record. And the record could burn the whole house down. She didn't know it yet, but her next move would force everyone in this room to reveal exactly where they stood. The sting on her cheek was still fresh, but the sting to her pride was sharper. Amara sat at the defense table, the courtroom's silence stretching like a taut rope. The bailiff, still planted by the judge's bench, stood with that smug stillness that comes when a man believes the system will always protect him. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Lewis," he said, voice dripping with patronizing calm, "are you prepared to conduct yourself appropriately, or should I hold you in contempt?" Every eye in the room shifted to her. The journalists in the back leaned forward, pens hovering over notebooks. Some faces wore pity, others, anticipation, waiting for her to snap so they could call her emotional, irrational, out of control. This was the fork in the road. She could keep her head down, finish the case, and file a quiet complaint after court, the safe choice. Or, she could expose exactly how far this corruption ran, knowing it might cost her career, her safety, even her freedom. Her mind flickered to something her mother used to say. In moments of public shame, they want you to shrink. That's how they erase you twice, once with the act, and again with your silence. She glanced at the clock. In precisely 37 seconds, the proceedings would resume, and if she was going to act, it had to be before the next words were recorded into the official court transcript. She reached into her bag and laid a single sheet of paper on the table. Not her notes. Not a legal motion. But an official court order, one the judge didn't know had been signed that morning by the state's Chief Justice. It named her, Amara Lewis, as the temporary presiding judge for this very case, citing a conflict of interest in the current judge's relationship with the prosecution. Her hand rested on it, not yet revealing it. Because she understood something most people never learn. A single action can flip the entire outcome, but only if you pick the exact second to strike. The paper on the table wasn't set luck. It was the final piece of a plan she'd been crafting for months, one rooted in patience, precision, and a deep understanding of how corruption shields itself. Amara knew you couldn't simply accuse a judge of misconduct and expect the system to clean itself. Power protects power. You had to let it trap itself, then bring in a higher authority that couldn't be ignored. 3 weeks earlier, she'd filed a sealed motion with the state's Judicial Oversight Board, detailing financial ties between the presiding judge and a series of expedited dismissals connected to the DA's office. Her evidence was airtight: bank transfers, recorded calls, and sworn statements from 2 clerks who'd risked their careers to speak up. The Chief Justice had been hesitant, knowing the political fallout this could cause. So Amara made her move quietly. She requested an emergency reassignment of the case, citing a conflict of interest, but gave no public details. By law, if the Chief Justice signed it, the order was binding immediately. That signature had come in that morning's mail, delivered directly to her office. She hadn't told a soul. And now, with the slap still echoing in the air, she realized this was the perfect, maybe the only moment to reveal it. The beauty of her plan wasn't just the evidence. It was the timing. Because in court, perception is everything. Reveal power too early, and they have time to maneuver around it. Reveal it too late, and the public forgets why it matters. But reveal it when the whole room has just witnessed an abuse of power. That's when the shift feels inevitable. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, the quiet pull of a single sheet of paper, would be studied in legal circles for years, as a masterclass in turning humiliation into authority. She slid the document an inch forward, just enough for the judge to notice the state seal at the top. His brow furrowed. For the first time that day, his gavel hand hesitated. The first reversal of power had begun. The judge's eyes scanned the top of the page, and his face drained of color. But instead of stepping down, he leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smirk curling across his lips. "Bailiff," he said, voice sharp, "remove Miss Lewis from my courtroom immediately." The order hit the air like a hammer. The bailiff, the same one who had struck her moments ago, stepped forward with deliberate slowness, the kind of pace that turns a walk into intimidation. The journalists in the back were scribbling furiously now, cameras clicking like insect wings. Everyone could sense it, the air was shifting, but the machine wasn't about to let her win without a fight. Amara held her ground, but the judge didn't wait for her to speak. "This order," he said, holding up the document between 2 fingers, "is irrelevant to these proceedings. This is my courtroom, and I decide what is binding here." The lie was bold, almost elegant in its brazenness. And that's how corruption works. Not always in the shadows, but right out in the open, counting on fear and confusion to paralyze the opposition. The bailiff reached her table. His shadow fell across her papers. She could smell the faint metallic tang of the gun at his hip. For a split second she wondered if they might actually drag her out. Not figuratively. Literally. The humiliation would be complete, her research buried, her credibility shot. But then she remembered something. The court was not just 4 walls and a bench. It was also the record. And the record had a voice far louder than this judge's gavel. She pressed the small mic clip to her lapel, a device she always wore, one that synced with a secure live stream watched by 2 reporters she trusted. The bailiff didn't know it, but every word, every movement, every refusal to acknowledge a legally binding order was now being broadcast in real time. Still, the weight of the moment bore down. The court clerk refused to look at her. One juror shook their head, already convinced the system would crush her. This was the breaking point. If she misstepped here, she wouldn't just lose the case, she'd lose the chance to dismantle the network behind it. And the worst part, she could feel her own pulse quicken, the first sign that fear was trying to make the decisions for her. Fear wanted her to blink first. But fear had never been her compass. Amara took a slow breath, the kind you take when you need your voice to come from the diaphragm, not from the tremor in your chest. She didn't look at the bailiff. She didn't look at the judge. Instead, she looked at the court reporter, the quiet keeper of the official record. "Madam Reporter," she said, her tone measured, "for the record, please note that I am holding a legally binding reassignment order from the Chief Justice of this state, signed and dated this morning. please read it into the record. The judge barked, "You will not?" But she cut him off, still calm, still grounded. "I am speaking to the record, not to you, Your Honor." It was subtle, but the room felt it, the shift. She wasn't addressing his authority anymore, she was bypassing him entirely. The court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering above the stenograph keys. Her eyes darted between Amara and the judge. And in that silence, Amara did something most people overlook. She removed the audience. She reached into her bag, and pulled out a thin manila envelope. Inside was a letter, not from a lawyer, not from a politician, but from the very whistleblowers who had provided her the corruption evidence. Their words were sworn under oath, their signatures verified by a notary. She slid it toward the court reporter. "This," she said softly, "is why the Chief Justice intervened, and it sits why the people in this room will either uphold the law or be remembered for the day they tried to bury it." Something in the reporter's eyes changed, the decision to start typing again. That was the spark. Not yelling, not threatening. Just shifting the center of gravity so the judge was no longer the only son in the room. And that sips the thing about systems built on fear. When even one cog stops obeying, the gears begin to grind. The judge slammed his gavel. "Remove her." But now his voice carried a thin crack, a sign that control was no longer absolute. Amara knew she had seconds before they tried something irreversible. And she had one final move left before this moment would tilt completely in her favor. The courtroom had become a theater of tension, but Amara moved like a chess player, every gesture precise, every word measured. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't demand respect, she earned it silently. Step 1. The court reporter finished reading the Chief Justice's order into the record. Step 2. She ensured every camera in the room, the news crews, the live stream feeds, the courtroom security cams, captured the moment. Step 3. She methodically reviewed every piece of evidence in her briefcase, confirming it was ready to present without revealing the full impact just yet. Her adversaries assumed panic, they assumed confusion. They assumed she would react emotionally after the slap. They didn't know she had spent months training for this exact psychological battlefield. Every subtle look she gave, every adjustment of papers, every step toward the judge's bench was a signal, not to the judge, but to the system itself. This court will obey the law, not intimidation. Her silent climb was not dramatic, no one applauded. But in those quiet movements, the tide was turning. The bailiff's hand hovered near the gun at his hip, but he paused, unsure if action would now make him the violator. The judge's smirk had hardened into a frown. He whispered to his clerks, but none dared move. Amara whispered nothing. She simply began reorganizing the courtroom, calling witnesses, arranging her evidence in logical order, quietly commanding the procedural space. Here sits the brilliance most people miss. When power is abused, it's not brute force that restores order. It's the patient, intelligent, and unflappable application of rules and knowledge. She had bought herself minutes, maybe seconds, to let the system self-correct around her. And every small action reinforced one undeniable truth: she was no longer a victim. She was the authority, quietly climbing toward her rightful seat. No cheers, no spectacle, just momentum. And in momentum, even the strongest walls begin to crack. She didn't know it yet, but the final reversal was only moments away, and when it came, it would leave the courtroom forever changed. The courtroom held its breath. Seconds, stretched into eternity. Amara stepped forward, her hand steady, her voice calm. She didn't shout, she didn't demand, she simply placed the Chief Justice's order on the judge's bench, and with quiet authority slid the chair backward. "This seat," she said, her eyes meeting the judge's steps, "is not yours to occupy while a conflict of interest exists. I am assuming my temporary position as presiding judge, effective immediately." A stunned silence followed. The bailiff froze, unsure whether to obey the original judge or the newly appointed one. The judge's face betrayed disbelief, then panic, then something worse, recognition. The cameras captured it all, every angle, every moment of hesitation. The public would see it unfold in real time. Amarasit's voice remained steady. She began reviewing the case with precision, calling witnesses and introducing evidence with calm authority. Every lie the prosecution tried to pass as truth collapsed under her methodical questioning. Every corrupt procedural shortcut the judge had taken was exposed, live, in front of the room. And then came the moment that shifted the courtroom completely. A clerk, emboldened by her composure, whispered the details of financial irregularities linked to the judge. Amara paused, looked up, and addressed the room. "Every action we take here matters not just for this case, but for every case that has ever been mishandled. Justice is not a suggestion, it is a responsibility." The judge sputtered, trying to reclaim control. But the courtroom had changed, public perception had shifted. The gavel that once represented unchallenged authority now felt hollow. A single action, her calm, deliberate assumption of the seat, had transformed the room. Power was no longer about intimidation. It was about strategy, intelligence, and moral clarity. By the end of the session, the verdict was clear. The evidence she had gathered exonerated the wrongly accused, revealed the judge's conflicts, and set in motion disciplinary action that would reach far beyond this courtroom. Amara had done more than win. She had shifted the system itself. The courthouse emptied slowly, the echoes of whispered astonishment lingering long after the gavel had finally fallen. The judge, once a figure of absolute authority, faced immediate suspension and an internal investigation. The bailiff, who had struck Amara in open court, was reassigned pending disciplinary review. Even the clerks and attorneys who had once turned a blind eye were forced to reckon with the system they had silently enabled. But the real impact wasn't confined to titles or positions. It was in the lessons the courtroom had absorbed, visible or invisible. Journalists filed stories that went viral, highlighting not just the slap but the brilliance and restraint that turned humiliation into lawful authority. Community members and activists shared the footage, analyzing the precise choices that allowed one woman to navigate an entire corrupt structure with intelligence and moral clarity. Amara herself didn't celebrate. She walked out quietly, her expression calm but resolute. She knew the victory was larger than any applause. It was in the precedent set, in the awareness awakened, and in the ripple effect that would empower others to act when the system sought to silence them. People began reaching out, young lawyers, students, and community organizers. They asked questions, seeking mentorship, trying to understand the mindset that had transformed a moment of violence into a movement of accountability. And Amara answered, not as a hero, but as a guide. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Power isn't taken by force. It sits earned through knowledge, patience, and moral courage. A single action, executed with precision, can change outcomes that once felt immutable. The corrupt judges' network began to unravel, quietly but irreversibly. And those who once underestimated her learned a fundamental truth: intelligence, strategy, and calm authority are far more disarming than rage. By the end of the week, the story had spread across state lines, inspiring legal reviews, whistleblower protections, and a renewed commitment to systemic accountability. Amara's fight had been personal, but the change it sparked was collective. She didn't just survive the system, she made the system bend to the law, morality, and reason. Weeks later, Amara Lewis returned to the same courtroom. The room was different now, not in its architecture, but in its energy. Lawyers, clerks, and even the jurors moved with a quiet awareness that authority is not granted by title alone. Amara had been offered positions of influence, speaking engagements, and mentorship roles, but she remained grounded. Her mission wasn't personal acclaim. It was to show that even in systems designed to oppress, intelligence, patience, and moral courage can create seismic change. She often reflects on that moment, the slap, the tension, the silence before her first move. Here sets what she teaches anyone willing to listen. Every system has a pressure point, every injustice has a vulnerability, and every person carries the potential to act, not in anger, but in strategy. A single well-chosen action can transform outcomes that once seemed fixed. Her story spread across communities, inspiring young Black professionals, activists, and students to see their own power not as a function of force, but of knowledge and patience. The legacy isn't set just in the case she won. It's in the mindset she demonstrated that dignity, preparation, and strategy can outmaneuver even the most entrenched corruption. And now this story is yours. Ask yourself, what is the slap in your life, the moment that demands you rise, not react? Where can you turn humiliation into authority, fear into clarity, and a single action into lasting change? She didn't just reclaim a seat in the courtroom. She reclaimed the principle that justice belongs to those who understand it, not those who wield it recklessly. Like, comment, and subscribe if this story resonated with your values. And remember, the quiet, intelligent actions you take today can change the course of tomorrow.